it kept feeding my interest because I would sort of be like, I've read Venom coming back to Spider-Man through, 3 cycles now. I'm done with this.
Right.
But I was able to find more stuff, and it's always been that way. Like I go through these phases where it's like, oh, I'm kind of tired of what I've been reading for the last couple of years. Let me dive into the black and white explosion books, or let me dive into manga, or, web comics or whatever. It never, I haven't found any limitation anywhere. Like the more I look, the more it seems there is. And it was just always, it was kind of, my favorite artists were that way too. Like when Frank Miller comes back in the early 90s with Sin City, that stuff didn't look like what he looked like to me when he left. It was sort of like, wow, this is different. It was like this kind of a dead line, and then like the big spotted blacks, and he's lettering it himself, so the lettering wasn't very polished. And I could sense all of that, because I'm trying to make comics then too. And it's like, oh, cool. Somehow this makes my lettering look better. It doesn't, I don't have to letter like Tom Warzakowski, I can letter like Frank Miller. But it was just, you see all of it, and it was all beautiful. I loved it all. And it seemed like the more I found, the more it just expanded into what comics could possibly be.
Readers see the cover of a comic. They see the characters, the explosions, the splash pages. What they don't always see is the design thinking behind the page and the choices that are made to make a comic actually work. Today's guest is someone who thinks long and hard and has spent a lot of time studying comics on that and every level. Jim Rugg is the artist behind cult classics Street Angel, the mind behind Marvel's Hulk Grand Design, and one half of the massively influential YouTube series Cartoonist Kayfabe. Alongside Ed Piskor, he's helped thousands of creators learn how comics really function, panel by panel, page by page, career by career. And now he's joined the team who work with Gary Vaynerchuk to bring V-Friends to the world, and is using all of those skills, and I'm sure more. Jim is part cartoonist, part historian, and part designer. His work pulls equally from Jack Kirby's bombastic punk zine DIY culture and the sensibility of someone who understands that a comic page is not just storytelling, it's architecture. Jim, welcome to Comic Industry Insiders. This has been a long time coming, and I'm so excited to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me, Adam. That's quite the intro. I love it. Thank you. It's fantastic. Maybe one of the nicest things anyone has said about me. And I appreciate that. So happy to be here.
Dude, I feel like if anything, I had to edit that down because there was just so much to talk about. You've done such an incredible job. And I will say that, and in personal context, we've talked about how one of the things that I think about when I think about Cartoonist Kayfabe is just how much you taught creators and even other industry professionals to think about this as something that we talk about a lot on this show, is thinking about it as a career, as an overall thing. And it's always, I don't know, I've always been, I think in many ways what we're doing here is on the shoulders of what you guys did there. So I'm nothing but respect for you. And we get to work with you on so much stuff these days. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you for the kind words on Cartoonist Kayfabe. And, I'm excited to have this conversation, Adam, because we started Cartoonist Kayfabe, I can't remember if it was 2017 or 2018. The landscape of comics is so different now. And seeing what you were doing with Prana, with Comics the Magazine, it's interesting to me to just see how people are making careers in comics. Like when I was a kid, It was impossible to think about outside of, if you're really good, you get to draw Spider-Man or Batman. And that was kind of the way that you would make, you could make a living possibly in this industry. And now, people are doing all kinds of stuff. They're sort of creating their own paths. They're almost writing their own job descriptions and finding ways to make this be a real profession. And I am all for it. And I'm all for the conversations around it because honestly, everybody doesn't think that way. So you almost need to see those examples and to see people like doing what you're doing what I'm doing what dozens of other people are doing. I think that model, and I guess models, it's really important to kind of like get out and share some of that because it's the history of comics is fraught with exploitation and bad behavior. Yeah. However, the opportunities and where comics are now, I don't think has ever been better. So, if you add a little bit of the business acumen and a little bit of a vision, I really think you can do a lot in comics now that you couldn't have dreamt of 25 years ago.
Well, and I would even argue that, like, at this point, I think it was, I want to say it was a tweet by Stephanie Williams recently where she said that you can't, like, even if you got the career drawing Batman or Spider-Man, like, it's not enough. You can't build a career that way. And publishers are the same. I think so many of them, like, it was a simple formula of do just enough to get into the Diamond catalog and suddenly you're a publisher. And that's no longer enough, right? You have to kind of be multi-platform no matter who you are. And you guys really were ahead of that curve in building an audience that was not just, this is how many I sell when I show, I think that's always been like a touchstone for me anyway.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say it. Ed and I came from a background of, like, I always say comics. And when I say comics, it's a language, it's an art form, it's newspaper strips, it's manga, graphic novels, comic books, web comics, webtoons. That's all comics for me. And it's kind of, when I was young, I had no comic book store, so I was lucky I bought comics at the drugstore or at a gas station, you could get them, although you can get comics at a gas station again, I see DC is selling them there. But it was really hard, so it was kind of like any scrap I could find that was comics, I scooped up, maybe a couple from the library if I was lucky. That was mostly Garfield and maybe Prince Valiant, semi-quality reproductions on Prince Valiant reprints. But it was hard to find in a lot of ways. And so, like, comics were just everything under the sun for me. They were all this variety. And I kind of have, we took that into kayfabe. We talked about a variety of comics. That had been really bifurcated when I first started, where it was like indie comics or alternative comics, which would be like Fantagraphics and 8-Ball, and then like mainstream, which is a weird word for it, but that would be your superheroes at Marvel and DC. And the two sides, there was a real tension there that I think was brought about by probably the Comics Journal and Gary Groth, and understandably so, and a lot of his point of view was art form and business. He wasn't happy with business practices of those companies. And he didn't feel that, they valued the art form and weren't producing the higher quality comics. But I don't know. I start making comics in 2000, start going to SPX and comic conventions and interacting with everybody. And all the comics were an influence on me. I didn't see those lines of like, you have to be in this camp or this camp. And I think that has been prophetic. I wasn't planning that. I was just kind of drawing from a bunch of different artists that I liked that happened to work across time and across different publishing models. But now that's what we live in. Like, it's just, you go to an average comic book store now, it would have been the best comic book store ever probably in 1999 because they stock some of everything, and it's almost like, again, what I would call an average comic book store. I mean, they've got stuff for all ages. They've got some manga. They've got some back issues. They've got new comics and graphic novel shelf. So it really is this world now of just everything. And, it's overwhelming. I'm old enough that when I was a kid, you would have Marvel zombies who might literally buy every Marvel comic that would come out each month. Yeah. And now I don't think there's no major publisher that you could do that with, let alone like keep up with everything that's happening.
Well, even if you could get all of their titles, getting all the covers it would be impossible. I don't know if it's there has to be somebody out there doing it. We're actually working with a client selling his collection of every Marvel comic up until like last year.
Wow.
And it's massive. It's a massive, massive collection. But I can't imagine anybody who doesn't just completely focus on that couldn't do it. You and I had a conversation about how it's almost impossible now to just keep track. Like, there was a time when I started selling comics in the mid-90s, I feel like I had a good handle on who was producing what and where, and what was new and what was interesting, and now it just I'll find complete hits, things I've never heard of that are selling incredibly well, and that's not even counting the stuff that's webtoons. Like, it's such a strange time, isn't it? That like you can niche all the way down, even in the creation of comics, and still build an actual career. It's phenomenal.
It is. And, we were just at Comics Pro. I saw you, I don't know, a week or two ago. It feels like
Something
2
like
years
that.
ago, but I think it was last week.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
But I had conversations with a number of publishers and retailers. And one of the things I came away from is there are parallel comic book industries that don't cross over at all. Webtoons is a good example. Like the top cartoonist on Webtoons, massive audience, massive readership.
Yeah.
And many of them have translated into print because the numbers in their audience are so great. They can do New York Times bestsellers if they'll make books, and many of them do.
Even a small percentage of those readers pick
Absolutely.
up a physical book. Yeah.
But that's really a parallel track. If you walked into most comic book stores and you asked them what are the top cartoonists on Webtoons or top strips, they would look at you like, what's Webtoons?
Yeah.
And some of them know Webtoons, but you know what I'm saying? Like, legitimately, you might have 10 million people following several of these cartoonists, and they don't cross over with what I think of as like New Comic Book Day Wednesday.
Yeah.
I talked to Dan, the CEO of Comics Wellspring. It's print on demand.
Oh, yeah.
There's
I
a
know
number
Dan.
of these number of these print on demand services. I use some of those for my self-publishing. They're convenient in a million ways. But talking to him, Comics Wellspring's been around for a while. I've known them. We've done some work with them at VFriends. Mm-hmm. He's describing one of his customers, and they sell sort of a retail component. You can buy some of the books that they print on demand from their like a central hub. So, if I'm a cartoonist, I can list my comic on there. I get an order, I get paid, they print it and they ship it.
Right.
I never have to warehouse it or anything. Pretty awesome system. And he told a story about a guy who started publishing there like 7 years ago, did 25 copies of his book, and now has, I think, like 400 titles, some that print in the tens of thousands. And that's when it clicked to me, like, again, that's a completely parallel comic book industry. That's where not only is that person making money doing comics and publishing comics, but they're also inspiring the people that are coming up, because you don't do 400 titles by yourself. What happens is you've reached an audience, which we now have the tools to promote and really build massive audiences, whether it's through YouTube and podcasts and social media and all these different mechanisms, where you can be a successful publisher. And again, have no presence, maybe people have no knowledge of you on Wednesday, New Comic Book Day world, which is where I kind of come from. Yeah. So it's interesting to me to just see these sort of different actual parallel comic industries that are running right now.
Well, I know that you met, I can't remember his name. I think his name is Brent at Impound Comics. I know that I saw you talking to him. This is a guy who he and his partner have been making comics independently. They didn't really know what they were doing. They never found best practices or anything. They just started making comics. And they've done over 20 issues of 7 different titles. And they only sell through social media, and that's it. And they are supporting themselves, and obviously their artists are getting a rate and whatever. But they just through that over something like 500,000 followers on TikTok, insane. And most of the people in that room had never heard of him.
Right.
It's beyond insane that there's so many different. Yeah, you're right. There are parallel comics industries, and I'm wondering how many there are at this point.
I am too. I've become really fascinated with that subject, and I have not. It's like I said, a week and a half that I've been thinking about this, so I haven't done any research on it. But I am interested in it. I did a podcast with Living the Line, Sean Michael Robinson, Austin English from Domino Books, Chris Anderson from Power Pulp Comics, and Carson Grumball also from Living the Line. And the topic was distribution. And going into it, I thought, nobody's going to listen to this. This is really dry. And it was one of the funnest conversations I've had about comics in forever. And I made a list to kind of just organize my thoughts, and came up with maybe 20 legitimately different distribution models that we have today. And it reminds me of the 90s, because I'm working with Steve Bissett on a Tyrant collection.
Yes.
Which, for anybody that doesn't know, that was Steve Bissett's dream project. He self-published it in the 90s. And basically there were 18 distributors, kind of the same model. They had a little bit of a distribution war. They collapsed, and only one survived. That was Diamond Comics. And when that happened, Steve stopped doing Tyrant because he could no longer make it work with just one distribution channel. But now we've got so many distribution channels that are, again, vastly different. It's not like it's just different distributors that all go to the comic shop. We've got distribution channels in every way, shape, and form you can imagine that are really finding readers and connecting to fans and collectors that may not have a comic shop, may have never stepped into a comic shop, and yet, let's say Kickstarter as an example, right? Like, we all are familiar with Kickstarter. People do massive campaigns, 6 and 7 figures sometimes of comics that, they're reaching fans that quite honestly aren't in the direct market. Right. And it's just incredible. It's an incredible tool. As somebody who makes stuff, what I say is a comic book's not done until somebody reads it. So the distribution's really important. If you're out there and you're an aspiring creator, you need to figure out that part too. It's not just, can I draw perspective and anatomy and tell a story in my art or whatever. It's also, how do you actually get that comic in somebody's hands or in somebody's eyeballs and somebody's brain? And that's the distribution. And distribution, this, Adam, it's so important, and it literally affects content. Like, when the direct 100%. Market shows up, that's whenever Love and Rockets shows up. That's when we can suddenly not aim at the widest common denominator, and we can actually do more personal, more targeted kind of storytelling, and comics flourish. Like you track them through the 80s, and it's like, oh yes, suddenly we have much more sophisticated storytelling, and I think you can trace that back to distribution. So it's an important topic. It's one I haven't heard that much, even though there's a lot of news with Diamond's collapse last year and whatnot. Yeah. But it's still, in my mind, what that translates into in terms of how does this new distribution frontier that we have, how does that affect content? And one of the things, and again, this is pretty new to me, this is something I've been talking about for a week and a half. I wonder if it's the kind of the emotional and psychological health of cartoonists, because this came up in conversations I've had with cartoonists about how, not everybody wants to go put their face on YouTube and, sure. sell their books this way. And that's reasonable to me. I don't think there's only one way to do it, and I don't think everybody is the same. These different distribution models allow for that. There are these instances, like I often think, what's a small publisher offer a cartoonist today? That might be what they offer. And, every publisher is different too. Yeah. But because of all these models, we were at a really fun dinner at New York Comic Con, you and I.
That was so much fun. That was the highlight of, honestly, not only working with V-Friends, but also, not only New York Comic Con, but working with V-Friends at all with just that dinner was incredible.
I remember the conversation went around the table in a lot of different ways, but one of my thoughts was an observation, right? I had done 15 shows last year. Usually I do about 3 conventions. For whatever reason, I did a lot. And what I said was, there's a surplus of talent. Like, every city that I do a comic book show in, there'll be a bunch of like self-publishers, small press guys, local talent. And it's better. Again, if I'd have seen these books in 1999, I'd be like, this is the best comic I ever saw. If I see it now, it's kind of like there are 20 books this good that come out on Wednesday. Yeah. It's mind-blowing, but it is so much talent. And I think that's part of why we have all these distribution channels now, because there's just, the needs are massive.
That's incredible. I'm working on this panel. Are you going to are you going to be in C2E2?
I don't have plans to go there as of now.
Oh, okay. So. Well, if you are, I'm doing this panel. I did it last year, called the Past, Present, and Future of Distribution, of Comics Distribution. And last year I had some really great panelists. And what surprised me was we had a room of, I don't know, probably held like 100 people. It was full of people who were interested in talking about comics distribution. I have arguably the show that we have right now, the live show that we do every Tuesday, is really because, the Diamond collapse caused us to have a lot of conversation about distribution and how that is shifting. You're absolutely right, man. This idea that I'm looking, I want to see your list, by the way, of the 20 different distribution channels, because you're absolutely right. I hadn't actually considered that the rise of the comic shop is what allows Love and Rockets and even like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Yes. There is no Turtles without the comic shop for a distribution. That's really fascinating. I hadn't considered that at all. Well, you just added to my panel. Excellent. Glad
to help.
Let's go back, because you just said something deep in there that in whatever research I did, I never really, I don't think I've ever heard everybody has kind of the same origin story of falling in love with comics, but you said you didn't start making them until 2000. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
What caused that? Because you're, no offense, not a young man. It seems to me that'd be later in life than I would have assumed.
I made comics before then.
Okay.
That was my serious push. You know, like I had done mini comics in high school. I even made some, I would make some in the summers because I basically graduated college in 99. So that's when I start like, listen, if I'm making comics, I got to make comics. And that's what I started doing. And I've been doing it ever since. So like I dabbled, you know, and I would do sample pages and send them places and you know, one year when I turned 16, I went to Mid-Ohio Con. I'm in Pittsburgh and that's in Columbus, Ohio. So not too far, to give John Byrne my mini comic. It didn't go great, but it was a pretty lousy comic, you know, and I will admire his honesty. But, you know, like I was, you know, doing what I think a lot of people do in terms of kind of, it was a side thing. It was something that I loved. It was something that I wanted to do, but also like at that point, that's the mid 90s, man, comics had gone from like, hey, Extreme Studios, we've got, you know, $100,000 sports cars, everybody on staff, 19-year-old kids drawing comics.
I know.
To like down, we were doing numbers. The 90s collapse, it's something like a loss of 90% sales. What other industry would survive if their industry tanked? 90% loss of sales is what happens in the 90s. So like in my mind, I was like, I have to do a day job and I'll make comics on the side. And a lot of people I liked did that because I was into indie alternative comics at that point. Right. And that was the truth of, you know, a lot of people in that field. So yeah, so the late 90s when I could have been really making comics, I was in school.
Well, there you go. But that was, I mean, the late 90s was a good time for the kind of comics that you and I love, right? That was really when everybody just said, you know what, if there's no money in it, we're just going to do shit we're proud of.
Yes.
Right? And we saw a huge resurgence. And that's arguably what brought us back to the you know, that kind of the cycle of the early aughts really starting to kick off, and then the stupid economy collapsed, and we all struggled there for a minute. But you know, that's what. But we do go through these cycles, and it does feel like we're on the edge of like one of those real ramps up. To me, I don't know if you're reading this the same way I am, but there just seems to be such a confluence of both the quality of the work and the audience that is like grown up speaking comics as a native language, realizing, oh wait, there's a comic shop here I've never been in. I'm a comics fan, I've never been in there. And like we're seeing the shops, I don't know, we came back from Comics Pro, everybody there was like, I don't know, the optimism is a good word for what we saw, right?
It's the best mood I've ever seen comic retailers in.
It's true, and they're a surly bunch. So seeing them in a good mood is almost a little disconcerting. But yeah, it was wonderful. Well, all right. So you start doing that. Where do you really start? When do you start hitting it with gas? I mean, what do you think? What are the first moments where you think this is a career I can really make happen?
I don't know about career, but in terms of the path, like I went to Pittsburgh Comic Con, which is kind of a mainstream show in 2000. It was my first show. I had self-published a comic book. Terrible comic, of course. Bad show, you know, like it's an indie black and white, not very well done comic. And that show at that point was kind of on down, its downward slide. But later that year, I did SPX, which is a small press show that's been going on for, 30 years now, kind of legendary. And it's self-publishers. And I went there. And I came home with 2 boxes of like mini comics that I'd traded everybody for. And the mini comic made so much sense because they're handmade. I could make 25 of them. So if it was bad, I wasn't stuck with like 1,000 or 2,000 offset copies of a terrible comic in my house. Right. I could just make a few, give them to my friends, trade them with people, things like that. And I start making mini comics for all these shows. And I do that for the next couple years. You know, you lose money at the shows, but I was working full time. The comics were kind of my night and weekends. After about, I don't know, I think it's about 2003, I make Street Angel as a mini comic, and I go to the next show on my schedule and sell out of them. And, you know, it's almost like now if you're posting stuff online and you go, oh, shit, that post, like, you know, it's spiked. There's something special there. Repeat that. Street Angel, the reaction was different. And so, like, I thought I had gotten a writing partner at that point, and we had come up with a lot of ideas. And it was like, we should do more of these. Let's see if we can find somebody to publish it. And I sent it to a couple of publishers, including SLG out of San Jose, who published like Evan Dorkin's Dork. You know, they had a long publishing record back to 1986. Johnny Homicidal Maniac was a huge hit for them at that time. And Dan Vado, the publisher, gets back to me. He's like, yep, we'll publish this. So that was my first published book, Street Angel. We did 5 issues in a collection with them. That got me on the radar at DC. So I went from that to inking American Virgin over Becky Cloonan, which was what a treat.
Oh,
and
wow.
doing Plain Jane's, like the first young adult graphic novel, maybe in the US. But it was the first one that DC was putting out in their Minx line. And that was with editor Shelley Bond, who I'm still friends with and really learned a lot from. And I was getting enough work at that point where it was like, I got to quit the day job or I got to turn down paying comic book work. And comic books were always the plan. So it was kind of like, you know what, you've paid off your college loans. I worked the day job for 7 years, saved a little bit of money, took my shot. So I quit in 2007, and I've basically been figuring out ways to pay the bills, with art ever since. It wasn't all comics. As you mentioned, that recession in 2008, I lost a graphic novel that I didn't have a kill fee in the contract for. So it was just like, that was one plan for the next year that's gone. And I lost a storyboarding gig for a video game. Same deal. I was young, didn't have a kill fee in the contract. People listening, if you're freelancing, get kill fees because things can go wrong. So that was pretty lean times. And I took on a lot of illustration work, to kind of like make ends meet and just kind of clawed my way out, was still making comics whenever I could, made Aphrodisiac in that time span. And, slowly but surely just kept kind of like persevering, which I see a lot of people give that advice now is like, if you want a career in comics, you just don't quit. And eventually, people know you've been there long enough and, hopefully you're good enough if you're still doing it. But you find ways to make it work. And I think that's true for like any arts career, like everybody I know around 2010, 2011, I kind of got involved in the local Pittsburgh arts community. I started grant writing for myself. I had income from grants at that time. I did artist residencies and it exposed me. I did my first I started my first podcast then, and I was just talking to people in the arts, not just comics. There were lots of cartoonists, but also people in the arts. And I kind of learned a lot just from other people who were trying to make a career in art. It's not a straight line. At the same time, there are resources out there. So, I always tell cartoonists, like, we often have this like humble kind of self-deprecating approach to what we do, that it's so specialized, but it's like, you're looking at it wrong. You're really, if you're making your own comics, you've probably got 8 or 10 skill sets that you're sort of developing, spinning plates, if you will, Mm-hmm. And it's like, you probably write more than 99% of the population, which is a great advantage if you decide to, hey, things are, thin right now. Let me apply for this grant. Well, guess what? That's just writing. And you've been doing that. Same with promotion. A lot of that is just writing and you've been doing that. So I kind of feel like storytelling is super trendy now. And if you're making comics, that's what you're really doing. So, you have all of these skill sets and it's a matter of just sort of applying them to whatever ends you want to apply them to. If it's to make a living, to pay the rent, whatever, it's a pretty robust skill set.
100%. I couldn't agree more. So much of what you're saying is the stuff that I, get paid, not nearly as much as I'm worth, but get paid to say to people on a daily basis these days, which is like, if you just keep going, at some point, just by nature of attrition, you are going to be one of the only people in the room who know how everything works, because that is just the nature of the business, is that it takes so long to iterate and learn, and you learn incrementally until you finally have it down better than 99% of the population. It's hard. It's not a great career if you're ready for like immediate results, but 100%. I do want to go back to something you just said. So you started your first podcast in 2011. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
That's really early in podcasting world. What caused you to make that leap? Because it couldn't have been something, as you said, a lot of artists really just want to be at home, working on their work. They don't want to be thinking about their public face or, promoting themselves. What causes you to do that early in the game?
I listen to podcasts when I work, and I've been listening to NPR, and as podcasts sort of came online, I transitioned to podcast, and I'm just curious. So like something that I become obsessed with, pretty soon I have to know, like, how does that work? How do you do that? Yeah. And podcasting, like comics, it's kind of a low barrier of entry. It doesn't take a lot of equipment or a lot of money to do it. And I combine that with, like, I had gone through this local arts professional training program. It was like a weekly, meet like each week and kind of talk about a different thing, like how to schedule or the psychology of making art or whatever. And I realized coming out of that program, like I have to learn to talk. Like I identified that as like, this is a really important skill set. And I thought like a podcast is perfect. And it was amazing because this is pre-video. So you would, you'd basically sit down, I'd have like a list of notes, I was all prepared.
Yeah.
And very quickly I realized like that the preparation is important. However, we're not just going to read questions 1 through 10. It very quickly became conversation, and that conversation was electrifying. You're sort of on because you don't know when the person's going to finish what they're saying, and you need to respond. You need to be kind of like with it, and it would snake around in all these different directions. And I would hang up and it was like I had just recharged myself, so I really enjoyed it. But I do think I learned to talk from doing that. And what I learned to do was listen, right? Like that was the big thing. I had nothing else except earphones in terms of like, what are we making here?
Oh, I get you. I will tell you right after this meeting, right after this recording, I'll probably have to get up and just walk around the block just to like burn off some of the energy because it is such a recharge. There's something so incredible about that. And I think a lot of it has to do with just it's the connection with somebody who believes in something that you believe in. There's that, but there's also just this like, it is the thing that sales is just conversation, right? I'm convincing you of something, you're convincing me of something, we're listening to each other, and then by doing so, we're getting that much closer. And I think these kinds of conversations allow us all, you and me, but everybody who's listening to it, these kind of parasocial relationships, they become closer. We all become closer as a result. One of the things my favorite things about Comics Pro this year was I spoke to 6, I kept count after a while, 6 different people who said they listen to my voice every day, which is kind of, I don't know. I still don't know exactly how I feel about it. If you're one of those, God bless you, but why? I have to listen to me talk every day. I don't know why you would want to, but it is kind of a goal, right? The idea is to reach an audience. It's just such a strange feeling. I don't know exactly how I feel about it. It's still weird, but yeah.
Yeah, it's very true. And, I think listening to that, because I'm a podcast listener first, before I was making one, I got the same kind of, maybe not the same exact level because it's pretty intense when you're the one in the conversation, but I still got that human connection. And I think the human part, it was really the part, you just said it and I agree with you. Like there's a real charge with like, what I found was a lot of the conversations were with people that I would meet at comic conventions, right? Like friends over the years. But at comic conventions, you meet everybody for 3 days. You have these like rapid fire, here's a minute. There's somebody else that's coming over. The actual sit down and like, let's talk for an hour. It was so, it's a human connection. And I didn't realize I was missing that until I started to have them. And then it was like, oh yeah, this is what I need. And I would encourage everybody that listens to this stuff and is reacting in some way to what we're saying, like find those human connections in your life, whether that's meeting your friend for coffee or whatever. It's so important. And I know when I get kind of off or down, usually what I need is some human interaction. So,
Amen.
Go find some of that somewhere. Doesn't have to be on a podcast.
But I will say that I think that my biggest regret in everything that we've done since I started Prana back in 2018, my biggest regret is that I didn't start something like this before, right? So that's part of why I'm so impressed that you saw it in 2011 is that like I had no clue. I had no clue that I needed to be building myself. I just thought it was good enough that the industry knew who I was. And so the idea of building a personal brand, it still sounds kind of icky, but man, it makes everything easier. Everything is easier.
It's fascinating to think that you can make something and then, put it out in the world wherever, right? If it's a comic book, you publish it, who knows where it ends up. If it's a podcast, you put it on these platforms and people find it and listen to it. It's incredible to think that you can make this stuff and then who knows? It's serendipity, like who knows who finds it, when they find it, what is it? The teacher appears when a student's ready or there's some expression along those lines.
Exactly.
And it's just interesting that you can make this stuff that's kind of ephemera. Like, I don't know about you, but often whenever I'm done with one of these recordings, if you ask me, what I talked about 2 weeks ago on a podcast, I'd be like, I have no idea. I don't remember what I had for breakfast today.
Yeah.
But it can reach somebody 2 years from now And it can have it can be that one piece of information that they were missing that actually allows them to take the next step in the project they're doing or the thing they're trying to accomplish. And it might not even mean anything to me, but it might be really important to somebody somewhere. And, you may live your whole life and never know that. Maybe never make that actual connection with like, no, it's meaningful to do this podcast.
Yeah, it is. And I know that I would have, I've been a podcast consumer for, probably as long as you at this point. But I have, I will say that those podcasts have been a huge influence on me. So that was part of it, was I wanted to make sure that we were having the conversations that I felt like were valuable, so that if somebody does bump into it, hopefully it can bring that impact. And, I don't know. It is still very strange, the idea that to have that kind of impact on somebody, but, you get used to it eventually. I wanted to, actually that does a nice segue into the next sort of chapter for you, which is this, what you built with Ed in Cartoonist Kayfabe. And just before we get into it, I can tell you that for me, it was one, your respect and intense, your desire to intensely understand some of the things that felt ephemeral or even less than, maybe art styles that many others would say, that was trash or whatever. And I don't want to name names or anything, but you probably know who I'm talking about. But the way you guys treated that with respect, but then also would do things like, I don't know, we were just using the word jobber the other day to describe somebody and realizing maybe that's not a nice thing to say, but it fit. But even like your page by page looking at Wizard magazine, there is no path where that doesn't lead to what we ended up doing with Comics the magazine, right? So talk about that, that genesis and how that came together, because it was so influential on so many people.
Ed and I traveled to shows together, like we're both in Pittsburgh. And so I've known Ed for, maybe 05, 04, 05, somewhere around there we met. And at first we would meet at a comic book store. And there were a handful of us. We would meet on New Comic Book Day, get our books, go to a coffee shop, and basically bring the pages we were working on. It was all people who wanted to make comics, and it was a positive peer pressure where like you didn't want to show up without new pages, because then you're not serious,
right?
And so that's the relationship that we had, for over 10 years before we started Cartoonist Kayfabe. And some of those rides to shows are like a day long. Like we did Heroes every year, and that would be like a day of driving, 3 days of the show where it's just constant comics talk, whoever you could corner, to like talk shop, whatever. And then back in the car to like drive home and unpack. What did we learn? What did we pick up? We were already kind of having those conversations at a relatively frequent high level. And we would joke about, man, we should mic these rides. This would be great podcast material. It'd probably be awful because of road noise. And also it just wasn't, nobody wants to hear 8 hours of that. But we did Baltimore. And again, I can't remember if it was 17 or 18, but we did Baltimore Comic-Con. And I remember Ed being like, here's the idea. We should do this on YouTube. We should do a YouTube channel. And, that was it. Like I went around Baltimore basically rebuying Wizards, because that's what we came up with, is like Wizards, what we'll talk about. We'll flip through it. There was a YouTube channel that did that with another magazine. And that was part of the idea, was like, we could do this and we can bring in examples of, whatever the articles are, we can pull comics from our collection and then talk about those and kind of just use Wizard as like a conversation guide, something for us to cover a bunch of territory. And we were both, Wizard was when we were like fanboys. So like we had both read those Wizards back in the day. We had started, there's so many places in the Pittsburgh area that have like dollar boxes. Almost every store has to have them because it's almost expected here.
Sure.
And we had started buying them anyway. And it was like a nostalgic drug, because I had read those intensely whenever they came out, when I'm a teenager. And then I don't look at them for almost 30 years. And whenever I went back and like looked through an issue, it was like literally I could feel stuff in my head where it was like, oh, this is a cool feeling. So like we were kind of aware of what we had in terms of like this will be the conversation starter. It's nostalgia. It was widely popular for, years. So it was kind of the perfect vessel to start with. And then it just took off. Like at first, I always tell people the community that came out of Cartoonist Kayfabe, I think, is the greatest thing that came out of Cartoonist Kayfabe.
Amen.
Completely unanticipated. And it shouldn't have been. Like I listened to podcasts where like the communities would build around them. WTF, like I listened to that from the very beginning. And shows like that, the community was like, oh, we know Mark Maron. But we were worried about like, does the microphone work? Do we have lighting? Do you know what I mean? Like we didn't know what we were doing. So there was so much focus on like, how do we actually make this happen? And then like, once it's up and running and like people are really into it, it's like, oh, this is, we hoped it would be successful, but we didn't spend a lot of time sitting and thinking like, what's this look like if people like it? And so when people liked it, it just was like, oh, wow. And, we just kept kind of building. It was like, well, let's do an episode that's not Wizard. We'll do 2 this week and it'll be about an artist or a mini comic or something that we had that we thought was interesting, that we thought we could talk about or wanted to talk about or wanted to show off or thought people would like. And it just grew. And then whenever it went into like overdrive turbo was when the pandemic happened. I remember saying like, we should just record and put them out every day. And Ed loved that idea. And so we started going daily. And then I think at that point, combined with everybody's at home, sort of like, is this the end of the world? We watched our, like that's when the followers and the subscribers really kind of went to the next level. And I think that, there was probably trauma for everybody that your whole life is disrupted. And now here I am with these 2 nerds thinking about comics. And, it was
comforting.
just kind of, it was just this sort of like right place, right time. Ed and I had such a history that I think that even the conversations we had, it'd be hard to duplicate that kind of stuff. You could get people that really know comics, but don't necessarily speak the same language. And we had developed that for, like I said, 10 or 12 years before we actually hit record. And so I think that was that's another thing people would tell us. They would talk about how, oh, it's like your friendship, it's like I'm in the circle with you guys or whatever.
Yeah.
And again, it's not like we planned it. It was just, it's what it was, but it was something that people ended up responding to. At least, I've heard that from a lot of people.
And you put it out into the world. I think that's really the biggest lesson, is that you're just trying to make sure that the microphone worked, and you were just doing what you had to do to put it out into the world, and not having to think too much about, what is the structure? How do I how do I interact with community? What is my merch?
And that was some of the fun, was like, we didn't know what we were doing. So if one of us had an idea, it was like, well, let's try that. Part of the motivation, though, from the beginning was definitely promotion. You recognize you mentioned how long it takes to make a comic. You get lost, especially today with so many people making comics. I think more people are making comics now than ever before. And Ed was smart. I understood the same thing, that like, how do you keep your name in front of somebody, especially as we move towards graphic novels that are going to take even longer than comic books. You might not be heard from for 2 years if you're only relying on your name on a book cover. Yeah. And so that was part of, from the very beginning, like we were doing this as a way to like promote our work, which, it worked fantastic for that. But it was a lot of things, it wasn't just that. It became kind of this, some stuff we planned for and some we just didn't. It turned out to be happy accidents.
When you and I were talking, I think through some DMs, I will say that my biggest takeaway from Cartoonist Kayfabe was that you taught many people to think about not just sitting down and doing the work, but also like, what does a career look like? When you are talking to younger cartoonists now, or creators of any stripe, what do you think the misconceptions they have of, say, earlier generations of creators are? Right? Because we've been doing this as a kind of a patchwork community that goes all the way back for decades now. Where at some point there were some things that shifted.
The one thing that I would say people don't understand, young cartoonists, is how exploitative the history of comics is. Like really bad. Read Men of Tomorrow and read about how who was the DC guy, but how these editorial and publishers treated the talent, right?
Yeah.
And that there are examples of that, but a lot of that stuff is fairly obscured. Robin Snyder, who published a lot of Steve Ditko's work towards the end of Steve Ditko's life, really for a couple of decades, actually, he did a thing called Comics, where it was like an oral history of comics. So anybody that worked in comics could kind of tell these stories. Frank Miller and Stephen Grant and another one of the Steves put out a fanzine in the late 80s. And it was the same deal. Like, they would give them to people that worked in comics for free, and they would publish basically whatever people that worked in comics would send them stories. And Arnold Drake had stories about when he was very young. And this is the creator or co-creator of Doom Patrol. This is an old timer from our standpoint, but he was not an old timer like Golden Age. He was kind of the next generation. And he tells a story, and I think it's in Miller's zine, about like going out with some old timers, or going out with somebody in the publishing side, sort of the editors, and they were talking about benefits. And whenever he got back to the company, an old timer told him this story. He asked about benefits, like, how can I get benefits? You know, they fired everybody. They fired everybody. All the freelancers were fired because one guy asked about benefits. You know, and this is in the maybe 40s or 50s whenever this happened. But it is I mean, look, go study, you know, Superman's creators, right? Like, they were living in poverty in the 70s when Superman had made, you know, billions of dollars. They weren't getting anything. So there is a terrible history of exploitation of talent in comics history. A lot of bad actors. And I don't think that people that come into comics realize that. You know, we're fans. We love these characters. We have our favorite artists. We don't always look at, like, what's the legal history here? Like, how did this work? You know, so get a contract. You know, you have to have it in writing. You have to. It doesn't matter how much you trust the person, how well-intentioned that editor might be that's kind of, you know, hiring you. You need the contract, because, like, this is an entertainment industry, and it's not just comics that have a very checkered past when it comes to talent versus, you know, The Office. And I just think that's one that people don't know that much about because they don't want to. You know, I can remember whenever the Kirby family, the estate, was kind of like escalating, you know, going through appeals against Disney. And as it was getting near the Supreme Court, it was sort of like, I saw fans turn on Kirby. You know, they were much more worried about, am I going to get the next Fantastic Four movie? What if the Kirby estate ends up with these, you know, characters? And it broke my heart. Yeah. So, you know, I think that's something that if you're talent, you know, nobody gets into comics unless you're a fan first. And I think sometimes that fandom may mean that you focus on the light instead of sort of the whole history. When I was 16, I met a guy, Ernie Steiner, who was an artist. He was drawing Nick Fury for Marvel at the time. I met him at a little show. You know, he kind of lived near me. I took sketchbooks. I'm showing him my stuff. He gave me a sample Batman script that I could do, like, my first pages from an actual script. When I finished some pages, he met with me to kind of go over them. But he also told me his story about, you know, comics. And it was tough. Like, he had done work at, I want to say, Now Comics, that didn't end up paying. It was like, as they were like going out of business, and it was around Christmas time. And, you know, like, this is an adult with children explaining to me at 16 about the hard times of comics. And it was, once you hear that story and you start looking for it, guess what? There are thousands of them.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there are thousands of them now. I mean, with the, even from a larger level, the number of people who have either been near bankrupted or close to it because of the Diamond bankruptcy, I mean, that just sends waves and waves out.
I feel like since social media has come up, I mean, it's every year there'll be some, you'll start to see freelancers that are like, okay, this publisher's not paying. Yeah. And you'll see it build, you'll see the publisher go out of business, and guess what? That talent still ends up, many people not getting paid for the work. So I think you just have to do as much homework on this stuff, treat it like a profession, really look at the business end of it, get a lawyer, you know, all the stuff that you don't, it's not the fun part. I always say, like, I don't get paid to sit at my drawing table. I'll do that for free. I get paid for all this other stuff, you know, and if you don't really cover yourself, history repeats itself, and it's continuing to do that. So I think that's one that maybe historically we could do a better job of being aware of the history of comics. Because the good news is there are success stories. There are Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird and Will Eisner and Robert Kirkman and, people who have Jeff Smith. There are enough people that we can study the people that have made it. Even the people that have gone, Frank Miller, that have made his fortune working Marvel DC. Like, there are ways to do that. So there are good stories too, but study the business part. If you want to do this on any level, you have to educate yourself on that.
Thank you. That is really good, and I'm going to try and leave that there because I have so much I wanted to cover with you. Well, let's move from business to art and taste. One of the questions that came up when I started asking people for questions is this is actually from our mutual friend Joe Keating. I'm curious how his taste in comics developed. We're similar in that we don't see a distinction between Rob Liefeld, Robert Crumb, or Osamu Tezuka. It's all just comics, whereas 10 years ago, those were so segregated. How does that develop for you? Is there a moment where you realize, okay, then I don't necessarily just need to be Batman, or whatever it was your intro flavor was? Yeah.
Whenever the Image guys go to Image, that was huge for me. Like I always said, my dream was to draw Wolverine until all my favorite artists were like, no, draw your own character. And so like that was a big shift. That was when I became more aware. And then, I'm getting older at that point. I'm starting to find comics journals. So now I'm reading about, again, Eastman and Laird, Dave Sim, Steve Bissette, Alan Moore, like a lot of these guys who, some of those examples I didn't find in the mainstream, but a lot of the guys I did. Frank Miller goes off and does, when he comes back, he's doing Hard Boiled and Sin City, and Frank Miller was like one of the first artists I followed. So like as guys were kind of making their own mark, it was at exactly the time that was on my radar. And, I don't know chicken or egg, which one comes first, because it's my favorite artist, so I'm following them, but they're talking about that stuff. And, as they start to make their own work, they're also making work like Sin City. As much as I might have liked Daredevil or Dark Knight Returns, it was its own thing. And Hard Boiled was totally its own thing. So as I'm seeing these things, I'm seeing art styles that I had not seen before, and I'm hearing conversations that I had not heard before. And that kind of opened it up. Because then I had to find a comic book store. Once these guys are doing stuff that's not at the newsstand, I found my first comic book store. And that opens up everything. That's Comics Journal. It's Faust. It's basically walking in and it's like, okay, I had blinders on, right? It was whatever was coming to the little newsstand in my town, and so like when I walk into the comic book store, suddenly it's like the vision's this wide. And I had seen little bits of it in Comics Scene magazine or in Wizard, and suddenly I had access to some of it. And at that point, like, I can remember getting I would order stuff from like the Kitchen Sink catalog or the Fantagraphics mail order catalog. And I can remember getting Xenozoic Tales by Mark Schultz and being like, oh, this is better looking than any color comic I have. There's no stigma against black and white anymore. Like literally that just went down. Up to that point, like the black and white stuff that I'd found would be sort of like 80s black and white explosion. I hate to say Drek because I love that stuff, but it wasn't high marks in terms of art and story. It was sort of like, oh, it's cheaper to print. So, if you're not quite A level, this is what you get. And whenever I saw Xenozoic Tales, it was like, this guy draws better than anybody else I've ever seen. So the black and white's not a hindrance. And then, you find the Crow and, it just becomes like clear of like, oh, we can keep going in these directions. I actually like black and white better, So, it was... I don't know if how the gradual part was me getting access to it. But as I would get it, it would just be like a sponge, It was like those catalogs I would pour over, like a little kid, used to get like the Christmas catalog with toys and, look at that stuff for hours. I would get like a kitchen sink catalog and just lose my mind, because I could afford like 3 books or whatever, but every page looked like some kind of exotic, like, they were all different in styles and weird characters, and the story descriptions, were mind blowing. And it just made me thirsty for like, I can't even picture what this might be like, reading like the first Madman comics or something like that, where it was like, it's a superhero, but it doesn't look like it. And I can't like, who's he fighting? You know what I mean? It was just, it kept feeding my interest, because I would sort of be like, I've read Venom coming back to Spider-Man through, 3 cycles now. I'm done with this.
Right.
but I was able to find more stuff, and it's always been that way. Like I go through these phases where it's like, oh, I'm kind of tired of what I've been reading for the last couple of years. Let me dive into the black and white explosion books, or let me dive into manga, or, web comics or whatever. It never, I haven't found any limitation anywhere. Like the more I look, the more it seems there is. And it was just always, it was kind of, my favorite artists were that way too. Like when Frank Miller comes back in the early 90s with Sin City, that stuff didn't look like what he looked like to me when he left. It was sort of like, wow, this is different. It was like this kind of a dead line, and then like the big spotted blacks, and he's lettering it himself, so the lettering wasn't very polished. And I could sense all of that, because I'm trying to make comics then too. And it's like, oh, cool. Somehow this makes my lettering look better. It doesn't, I don't have to letter like Tom Warzakowski, I can letter like Frank Miller. But it was just, you see all of it, and it was all beautiful. I loved it all. And it seemed like the more I found, the more it just expanded into what comics could possibly be.
So I wanted to talk about the role that zines had both in your life and in, now that you've done this research, that they have had in the culture of comics and developing us as an industry. You've already talked so much about Gary Groth and what he did in the Comics Journal for those people. And I think it's, I won't be the first person to point out the irony that Fantagraphics is now reproducing a lot of the work that he was railing against. But yeah. So talk for a minute about that, because it was a wonderful piece, and thank you again for doing it.
Oh man, my pleasure. Yeah, I love comics history, and a lot of that stuff is preserved in the zines and the magazines. And before I found comic book shops, it was Comic Scene was sold on newsstands, so I would pick up Comic Scene, and they did a great job of having, some A-list cover material, whoever the hot artist was, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But they would also have like a great cross-section. Like every Comic Scene I would pick up would introduce me, at least half the magazine would introduce me to stuff I'd never heard of, creators I never knew, history of comics, stuff like that. Wizard, sort of the same thing. Like those were both magazines I could get before I had access to a comic book store. And what they did was whet the appetite. They sort of, I would equate it to looking out a window and kind of seeing the world outside. And it's like, I have a limited viewpoint, but it's almost like they added more windows where I could see like more and more stuff. Historically speaking, they go back to pretty much the beginning of comics. And I cover this in Comics, the magazine, with some of the history. But it was at a time when comics were just considered like really lowbrow, beneath, if you're not like a special needs kid, you shouldn't even be reading them, which was about how they were treated in my life in the late 80s. So like for decades, they were really looked down upon. They weren't in schools. They weren't in libraries. It was up to comic fans to preserve the history. The famous zine story is the guys tracking down the good duck artist. Yeah. Everybody knew the comics, but they didn't know Carl Barks. That's fandom in the zine makers who put a name to Carl Barks for all the rest of us. One of the all-time greatest cartoonists to ever draw comic books. And that was found by fandom and people who were just writing about the comics that were the best comics, or at least the comics that they thought were the best comics. And in a lot of ways, that's where the canon is invented. The Carl Barks Ducks comics, the Will Eisner comics, the EC comics, right? Like, that was one of the early comics zines just focused on EC. And this is after the demise of EC, and yet the legacy would continue on because of people making zines and making these magazines about the comics that, again, kind of stand the test of time. That's established by fandom. It's amazing. And honestly, it still kind of goes that way all the way up to now. Because, again, nobody's making a comics magazine based on, oh, this is a gold mine. Comics are hot. Let's cash in. It's still being done by the people who are fans, fans first. And, it's nice now because you can actually take a class in comics. You could write about comics in your English class in high school without having to defend your choice before you even write the paper. Sorry if this is very specific, but that's what the magazines did. They preserved history at a time whenever people were burning comics. Everybody in comics I know has a story about their mom threw out their collection.
Yep.
How many of those stories have you heard, Adam? Right? I mean,
As a
hundreds
comic
of them.
shop owner, every day you hear some version of that. Every single day.
So
Yeah.
these magazines were the opposite of that. You know, they were saving the comics history. They were recording, hey, guess what? This artist is really good, or this run is good, or this publisher even, you know. We live in a time now where so many of comics publishing history is kind of not well preserved. And so where you find it is in the zine history of comics. You know, when these magazines, when Charlton, although I don't know how many people were championing Charlton, but, you know, certainly like a lot of St. John's or something, you know, like these publishers that have kind of disappeared in a lot of ways from the public, the record is by these fan historians.
Yeah.
And it's grown, it's gotten more sophisticated. The reprints are better and better as a result of where we are today in terms of production. But I think you can trace all of it back to the comics, magazines and zines.
Well, and beyond that, like beyond just documenting, they were the source of community, right? People
That's
would
true,
rally
too.
together making those zines. And we had Hank Canals on here talking about how the formation of Youngblood and arguably even the beginnings of what would later become Image were founded on relationships where people found each other through those zines that were
Yes.
just focused on their love of, I don't know, Teen Titans, I think it was.
And,
Yeah.
you know, tons of talent, that's where they're first published, are
Yeah.
in these zines. And big people come out of this. Roy Thomas, who would be editor-in-chief at Marvel for, I think, was he the first editor-in-chief after Stan Lee? He was pretty early on, and he comes out of the fandom and making zines, making Alter Ego.
Yeah.
Paul Levitz, president of DC. President?
He was. I
title
think
there.
he was. I think he eventually was president.
Yeah,
towards the
president
end.
or publisher of DC, but again, like top of the line guy, comes out of comic fandom and writing for these magazines, and it is the same as it is today, right? Like you're supposed to go network. You want to work in comics, go to the conventions, meet the publishers and the editors and your fellow artists, and you network.
Sure.
And that's what they were doing. You know, this is before conventions, before the internet, before social media. They're trading their little, you know, typed hand typeset photocopied zines
Yeah.
back and forth, and they all know each other. You know, it's incredible. And there's some great writing on that, the history of fandom too. Like Bill Shelley has written a lot about that. But those fanzines were instrumental in building a community.
Where do you think the future of that lies? Is it still that sort of? Is there a possibility for it to still be that sort of social nexus point? Does it still work that way? Do you think?
Yeah, I don't see why not. You know, you continue to find young cartoonists and promote their work. You'll continue to draw people who want to write and want to kind of tell their stories and champion the books and the artists that mean a lot to them. I don't see why you can't be that nexus still, because those issues still exist. You know, you're not going to cover all of comics. You would need thousands of pages a month to do that.
Yeah.
But you're still going to introduce artists. You're still going to introduce good books. You know, that first issue has a fantastic variety of those types of things. And I think that in terms of a community or a social piece, there are several avenues in the first issue, whether it's, you know, like you have your top 100 valuable comics list in the back. It totally lends itself to going to the comic shop and asking for one of those books, right?
Yeah.
It has reviews of comics. It has interviews with some young cartoonists. Dave Baker writes about Sammy Harkham's Blood of the Virgin graphic novel, one of I think the all-time great graphic novels, and pretty far away from the absolute Batman, you know. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like come for the Batman, leave with like a whole list of stuff that you might find at your local shop. I think some of that community comes through the shop too. You
Yeah.
know, it's a matter of the shops looking at Comics the Magazine and maybe making a counter display or something too that says, hey, if you read, you know, this is what's covered in Comics the Magazine this issue, and check out some stuff that maybe you wouldn't normally. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. You know, the other part that I would recommend is the online presence. So I have a friend who does a really great zine called Dummy Zine. I don't know if you've heard of it or not. 2 issues are out. Issue 3 is coming soon. And I think it's one of the best comics publications I've seen. The first issue is Pee-wee's Playhouse. It focuses on like Gary Panter, Wayne White, some of the artists who provided art because he's friends with them. So they gave him a bunch of art. So it's sort of like this huge Pee-wee's Playhouse kind of looking at the art behind Pee-wee.
Oh, cool.
It's a great issue. And the second one is an Air Pirates focus, but it also focuses on
Shit.
infringement of Disney copyright. And it's incredible, man. He actually tracked down cover art and some other pieces from the Air Pirates, had them scan, got the collector to lend him the art. He brought it here. He's Pittsburgh based too. Had it scanned by the same company that scans for the Andy Warhol Museum and the Carnegie Museum of Art. So maybe the best reproductions of these things ever, but his background is in law. So he's kind of going through, it's the one comic that made it to the Supreme Court was the Air Pirates. So he traces that. He interviewed all the still living participants of the comics, but he also goes deep and it shows sort of the other, like Wally Wood's famous Walt Disney spread from the Realist of like all the debauchery of the Disney characters. Talks about the history of that, does a really great reproduction of that. It's an amazing, amazing magazine. But what he does that I haven't seen you guys doing yet is his social, because it takes him a while. He's a one-man operation. So issues might be a year between issues. Don't want people to forget about you. His social media is just kind of sharing the stuff that's passing across his desk. He has a very specific point of view. So it all makes sense. Like if you like an issue of Dummy that you've seen, you're probably going to like his social media because it's almost like, here's Micro Dummy, like some underground comic that I just got hold of and check out this artist or whatever, or ephemera, like here's the t-shirt from the Hate Ball tour, stuff like this. It totally fits what he's doing. And I could see you guys figuring that part out with Comics the Magazine. What is the social media version? Because that's another place where the community really expresses itself. And with what you're covering, it feels natural that like that blurred line between like, here's the print edition and here's kind of what we're looking at and sorting out and the stuff that didn't make the issue, almost like the director's cut and the behind the scenes. There's just so much material. In a lot of ways, the magazine, the print copy is the tip of the iceberg and the social media can be the rest of that iceberg.
It has been a challenge that we've not even really begun, I think, tackling seriously, which is, on the one hand, we want to make sure that the print version is the best version. It is the one we put the most work into. It is, and we don't want to weaken that. Like we've gotten several offers to do digital versions of it, and it just doesn't feel right. It feels like it would be a cheaper version of the print. Not saying that we won't, we just have to find a way in, And so I think part of the problem is that none of the people on our team, except maybe Rico, who does such a good job of like doing kind of faceless social media, is like none of it is the native language for any of us. But we're going to get into your relationship with our good friend Gary V here in a little bit. But every time I watch his stuff or read his books, I'm always like, I know I need to be. I know. I just can't seem to find I can't find it. It's just not enough time in the day. Yeah. So
I am guilty of that too. And, you mentioned Gary V. DJ Kaufman is the executive creative producer. He's kind of the top of the comics team, and I've known him for 30 years. Love the guy. He has gotten so good at like taking 10 seconds, 5 seconds of video like throughout his day and then stitching them together and throwing it up. And it's very compelling. Like I love comics. So watching another person kind of like, what's their day of making comics? And it doesn't seem to take that much time the way he does it. And I'm like you, it's not natural for me. And so I need to do a better job of it. And I'm around people that are really good at it. So then I feel even worse. But you only have so much time, and it is kind of a struggle. Like, maybe what you guys need are a couple of interns where like their focus is almost like, listen, document a little bit every day what we're doing and post it. Because I can only imagine the stuff that crosses your desk to produce an issue. And I would think that kind of thing could really expand your community.
And beyond that, I mean, we work with so many different clients at this point. We're working on so many different projects. We have the podcasts and this, and I 100% agree. When I look at what I do for a living, and I think back to you and I were seemingly the same kid in our 20s. Like these are the things that I was so wrapped up in how cool it would be to work in comics. Like the idea that there's somebody like the 50-year-old me, documenting some of that makes would blow the mind of 20-year-old me, and I'm sure he's out there. I would love to be able to provide that to him, but whatever. We'll get there.
There's probably 100 of them out there. That's the thing too with the world we live in. when Comics the Magazine drops, it's going to create fans that have no idea it's even coming. You know, that maybe it'll be the first comics magazine they've read. And that speaks to me because I remember those first comic magazines that I got hold of where it was just like, oh my, you know, I'm worried about like New Warriors number 17 coming out next month. Yeah. And they're showing me stuff that I never even dreamt of. So, you know, that's the potential that you guys have. And especially with the numbers you're pulling and the way comics are right now, it's going to be really interesting to just kind of see like what effect that has and what starts to come back to you as a result.
I know. Every time somebody asks me, so what are you expecting for number 2? Or, you know, I'm like, here there be dragons. I have no idea. Like, I don't know anybody who's dealing with what we're dealing with. I don't even know who to ask. You know, it's been a real weird year. So, all right, let's get into your current gig because I think this one is, so just behind the scenes.
I was going to be snarky and say which one.
Okay. Well, all right. Give us a list of the current gigs. Let's start there.
All right. In June, I wrote a book, Wolverine Weapon X, for Bloomsbury. That'll be out in June. And that's kind of a critical analysis of Barry Windsor Smith's Wolverine origin, Weapon X. I'm so excited for it. It's by the same publisher as the 33 and a third line of books, which are music books where writers will take an album and they'll just write 25,000 words about an album. It's a really cool series, and I'm very optimistic that this is going to be the equivalent for comic books.
How did that come together? Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I say the easiest way to hire me is to ask me to do something I haven't done before. So I got an email, like a cold email from Bloomsbury asking if I had any interest in, you know, writing a book for them for this new line. And I was like, that sounds terrifying. Yes, I do. Let's figure this out. I sent them, man, I just did one this past weekend that scared the hell out of me. But I sent them, you know, some ideas for different books, and Weapon X was the one that we landed on. And that was it. You know, I did a proposal that was almost like half the book because it was really like detailed. Like there are 13 chapters, just like the original serialization. And, you know, I had outlined each chapter. So like once they came back with the approval, it was kind of like, wow, the book's half written, you know, now I just have to kind of like fill out these chapters. I'm really psyched for it though. It went really well. The experience was great. Marvel seemed very on board, you know, like it had to go through their approval as well. And I've heard good things from them. So I'm very excited for that and kind of to be a part of it, but also just for that line to exist, you know, just for, again, different doorways for people to come into comics is what I see with these books. Power Pulp Comics, it's a collection of self-publishers that I'm a part of. They started last May, so they're not even a year old. We have 40 members. PowerPulpComics.com is where everybody can go to order these books. We are basically a distributor, you know, a small distributor, but not that small. We do 50% off to retailers. We do free shipping at $200 orders, but we also sell to individuals, collectors, readers, you know, people that don't have these books in their comic shop or maybe don't have a comic shop. PowerPulpComics.com. It's a wide variety of stuff. We have zines, comics, graphic novels, and they're all self-published. So it's pretty awesome, kind of the diversity that you can find there, and we continue to grow. So check that one out. I am doing Tyrant. I am designing 2 editions of Steve Bissett's Tyrant right now. I'm in the midst of the design work for that. That's going to be going on Kickstarter. Probably whenever this drops, it'll be about the time the Kickstarter starts. One is an original art collection. So this is like an artist edition, you know, 19 inches by 13, I think. And it's reproducing the actual original boards for Tyrant, which is one of the most beautiful comics I've ever seen. For anybody that doesn't know it, it's the life of a T-Rex. It's incomplete, but what we have is phenomenal, and it's going to be beautiful. I've told this story many times, but I got a sample of the scans in. I didn't scan them myself, so we wanted to go through, give us a sample, make sure its settings are what we want. I almost cried. You know, like I had it on my big monitor. I'm zoomed in. This is work that I copied when I was a kid, and to see like the marks, and I'm so excited for that. We're also doing a complete edition. So that'll be all 4 issues, including back matter, plus a lot of material that went into creating it. A couple of text pieces, like there's a paleontologist that Steve worked with who wrote a really nice text piece that's going to go in the book. So that'll be available through Kickstarter and hopefully through your local comic book store shortly thereafter. And then I think the project that you alluded to, Adam, is V Friends. This is
Yeah.
Gary Vaynerchuk, Gary V's line of comics. I started there in September last year, so I don't know how long that is. 5 months, I think I've been there at this point, and
That sounds right.
I've written 4 books, and I've written and drawn 2 books, and my first book will be out March 13th. The first one that I wrote and drew under a beautiful Bill Sienkiewicz variant cover, which is talk about a dream come true.
Oh my God.
I'd like to go back in time to like 13-year-old me dreaming of comics, or by the way, like 40-year-old me dreaming of comics.
Sure.
And be like, listen, you're going to hire Bill Sienkiewicz to do a variant cover on your book, on your funny animal wrestling comic.
It's awesome.
Thank
That
you.
chick track, by the way, I have been obsessed with chick tracks for so long. In fact, I always keep 1 or 2 here on my desk just as
Nice.
examples.
Mine
I
up
am
for anybody that doesn't know what we're talking.
Oh my God, that thing is awesome. So talk about the evolution of your time there, because I think, Gary, for a certain population, I keep describing to people when we were talking about him coming into comics, I would say that I say the name Gary Vaynerchuk and I get one of 2 responses. I get who, or it's like I just said Brad Pitt, right? It's one, but there is no middle ground. There's no, oh, I think I heard of him. They all like that. You either absolutely love him, or you are, in some cases, it goes the other way. There's plenty of people who had negative feelings about him, but they were just as intense, right, as the people who loved him. Like, it's an incredible person to enter our field. And so when I heard that you were brought in, I will say that I had my, like, I kept poking at them that I feel like some of these things are a little bit weak here and here. I think maybe we should take a look at this. And then when I heard you were in, I'm like, oh, you guys don't need me anymore. You guys got this. Jim knows exactly what I'm talking about. Tell me about how that process has been, because I'm fascinated by the whole thing.
Fascinating is the right word. I am too. I quit my day job, like I said, in '07. I never expected to have a boss again, or, be on a salary or whatever. DJ Kaufman has been working there for a couple of years. It started out, they were doing some webcomics. So Gary created this cast of characters, like 250 characters, about 5 years ago. And those characters have gone through various collectibles. His background is in, running the world's biggest ad agency, being a digital pioneer. He was sort of the creator economy spokesperson or promoter early on. People know him because he's so present online. Mm-hmm. You know him. He's written many books. He's sort of this entrepreneur and puts that energy out there and those ideas. Very generous in that way. And so he creates this line of characters that are kind of focused on emotional intelligence, which is really different if you think about like superheroes and Batman and Spider-Man, which is kind of one of the interesting dynamics we're involved with now, is to like, how do these comic books sit next to a Batman or a Spider-Man? And we're figuring that stuff out. But he creates these characters, he goes through trading cards and stickers and has a fan base for them, and decides the way to make my fans fall in love with these characters is to tell the characters' stories, and comic books are the best medium for storytelling. And he hires DJ Kaufman, who starts doing webcomics and sort of comic strips. And this goes on for a little bit, and eventually they get to comic books. And they start making comic books last year, and they hire a team. They've got a couple of cartoonists on staff that are really good. And they basically like the results, and they're ramping up. And DJ calls me out of nowhere and is like, hey, any chance we can get you to come and join the team and do this? And in my head, it's like, no, there's no chance of it. And I know Gary, I know of Gary, and it's really impressive. And I know DJ, like he's been telling me this stuff, and I'm very happy for him. He loves it. But it just wasn't how I envisioned, what I was doing in my life. But they would do these things called creative offsites, where they'd like go rent an Airbnb or whatever, and the creative team would go there, Gary would go there, they'd spend a couple of days, and they would just kind of like work out stories for like the next batch of books. And they had one of those coming up, and I'm like, I will go to that. That sounds awesome.
That sounds fun.
That's like an artist retreat or a residency or something.
Yeah.
And I thought, I can do that. I'll give you my all for a couple of days. We're just talking comics for 3 days in the middle of the woods. So I do that, and I leave there, and it's kind of like, man, that was great. That was fantastic. And I have not been having the greatest time making comics, leading up to that. Right.
Yeah.
So I had kind of a down year, and I came away from this couple of days just feeling really good. Like, man, I liked everybody there. I liked the back and forth with Gary. It wasn't like he showed up and he's dictating and we're taking notes. It was like almost like improv. It was just really fun, and like I said, comics talk for 3 days. So yeah, they made me an offer, and I was like, change is great. I've been kind of doing the same thing for 20 years. I'm not very happy at the moment. Let's shake things up. And it's been fascinating, using your word, Adam. It's been fascinating. It's extremely different than any comics making experience I've had so far.
Yeah.
It's been fun. I like the characters. I like the idea of these characters being, emotionally intelligent, and let's work on Gratitude Gorilla or, Genuine Giraffe or, whoever the case may be. It's funny because like my first written and drawn story is a funny animal wrestling comic. So I'm pairing up these personalities of characters almost like a wrestling character, right? Where it's like ramp up the greedy character or greed or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's just been fun. And, watching like, I think about all this stuff. Like, I just don't want to do jobs based on money. Like I don't want to take a job based on money, and knock on wood, I don't really have to at this point. So like, what else is there? What are the other benefits? One of them is I love the team. Like we get together every week. I taught for like 10 years at the School of Visual Arts. And I loved that interaction with the students. It was a chance like meeting them and going over their stories and, like working with them throughout a semester or a year was very rewarding. And I stopped doing that 4 or 5 years ago, just schedule. It was the most time consuming and kind of the least paying to, Sure. Something had to give in my schedule, and that's what happened. But it was a great, rewarding experience, and I'm getting some of that from VFriends. Like there's a really good community, both of cartoonists that are working there. We hire some freelancers. Like I wrote my first 2 scripts for some other artist to draw, so that was awesome. That became like a weekly meeting then with the guys who were drawing those 2 books, which was really cool. The support team, like the comics is a small part of VFriends. It's not like it's just a comics publishing company. It's one piece of what they do. So like we've got marketing people and, social media managers and people that are working with the printers and doing all these different jobs. And they're all great. Like it's hard to explain. I think it kind of comes from the top down, like my interactions
Sure.
with Gary are really positive. So there's a social aspect that I've really enjoyed there. And it kind of reminds me of whenever I used to meet with my friends every week, and it's like, you don't want to be the one that doesn't bring some good pages. The people that are drawing comics there on staff are all really good. So we're constantly like looking at each other's stuff. It's very positive, which I don't think every publishing situation is from, what I've heard. And then like, what can I learn also is another factor for me. And part of what I can learn is just watching how they promote, how they use social media, how they kind of look at content and what is content. And it's like, yeah, film yourself drawing for 10 seconds. Doesn't have to be a big full day production. Just get a snippet of, inking Mojo Mouse or whatever on the top turnbuckle. It's a lot of stuff is self-evident once you become aware of it.
Yeah.
But sometimes you just need to see it. And I feel like just interacting with everybody and people that aren't even doing the comics, I'm learning a lot that maybe some people it's obvious, but not necessarily obvious for me. So I've been enjoying that part. DJ and I have started doing a live YouTube show weekly called Making Comics Now, where we'll have whatever issue's coming out, we'll have the cover artist come on, or we'll have the artist of the book come on, or the creator, whatever creative role. And that part's fun, and that's something that goes back to kayfabe and goes back to my podcast before that, just talking with other artists and kind of seeing like, how'd they get here? How did they do what they do? Mostly I'm self-taught as a cartoonist. And so there's a lot of learning opportunity here. I've come out of meetings and some of these retreats, and I come home and it's the same electricity that we've talked about a couple times. Yeah. And my wife will be like, what happened? What's going on? And I'll be like, I had no idea how much I don't know about comics. And you know what? That's a great feeling at age 49 awesome. And 25 years of sort of comics being my life. It's been pretty awesome, like really seeing it from some different perspectives.
I love that for you. I love that. I love the energy that you have when talking about this. Like it's such an odd little project, from an editorial standpoint. Like I struggled to get my head around the vision, but man, the people there were like undeniable. Right? DJ and Andy and I mean absolutely Gary. I mean Gary's a force of nature when he's in the room. But I can't wait to see what you guys end up coming up with, in the long term and how this affects comics. I mean, will it be, and I know you can't answer this, but like, is it going to be another parallel track of what comics is, or is it going to, is it going to become part of that Wednesday cycle? I'm fascinated to see where you guys end up. So,
I mean,
yeah.
I can tell you that we all want it to be part of that Wednesday cycle.
Okay.
What we are doing is trying to figure that part out. We don't want to sell books to retailers that sit on their shelf.
Yeah.
So we are building that audience. We are trying to kind of create that sense of demand. One thing I'll tell you that's been real energizing for me is New York Comic Con was my first show after I joined VFriends. I was with them for about 3 weeks when New York Comic Con happened. And I was a guest at New York Comic Con, so I was kind of set up away from VFriends, but VFriends readers would come to me, because like I had done a cover at that point, so they would show up to get it signed or I had a sticker. And I would ask them about their comics reading. And most of them, their first comics were VFriends. And that's awesome. Creative comic book readers, like, sign me up every single time. Amen. So, we are building some new readers, and the idea is to push them into comic book stores. So it's still very new. Gary's track record encourages me to, he's done this in several industries from wine to trading cards and really everything in between in terms of marketing. So I'm excited to see what impact it'll have on comics. I think that there's a lot of potential there. As much as I love comics and as much as I think they're in a great place right now, I just think the sky's the limit.
And especially you think about, brands like Gary's brand and all that he works with, even things like was it called Murder Drones? I think that was the newest thing coming in from Oni. Like that was a huge, huge brand outside of comics. I know the stuff we're doing with Rekka on The Future is really all about focusing in on bringing people in, these people that would never go into a comic shop, go in for the first time. Like this is seemingly, once again, get back to my optimism about where we are and where we're going to be tracking for the next few years. It's just like now seems to be the time where all the arrows are pointing in to these community centers that you and I have been going to for decades, right? And have we've all been like hanging on for whatever's next, and finally we found our place in the place that is next. And yeah, I'm so excited.
I think what's next is like 30 things. You asked about Comics the Magazine, and that might be it too, is you learning to trust your internal compass in terms of what are you hearing over and over? What are you excited about? Because those people that are coming to comics and are new to comics, Comics the Magazine is going to be a very attractive thing to pick up because, hey, there's a lot I don't know. Let's see what this magazine can show me. And so, in a lot of ways, like you're sort of one of those beacons of like, I can help you guys. You're new here. Pick up this magazine. I'll show you a whole bunch of artists that are worth your time, books that you should pick up, or descriptions of books so you can kind of pick and choose what appeals to you based on, this review or that review or this interview. I think that's a huge, that's something that comics need more of. And it wouldn't surprise me if a year from now you see more of those magazines in the comic shop.
I believe so. We've already heard from a couple that are getting started up, and I'm more the merrier as far as I'm concerned. Like, part of the problem that we're having is communicating to people, oh yeah, this is how magazines work. You haven't had to deal with them for 20 years, but now like once we built the door, I want other people to come in the door, because it was such a valuable resource for all of us for so long. I tell the story often about how for a while people kept telling me you need to start a magazine. I'm like, I don't want to start a magazine, but after a while you realize we need it.
Yeah.
And even though I've never made a magazine before, like it's, we somebody's got to do it. So why not us? Yeah. That's kind of where we came, how this whole thing started, which is, probably not the thing I should be admitting in public. All right. Well, I feel like I've used up a lot of your time today, and I am super grateful for that because I've been a fan for so long, and you know, you've been such a supporter of a lot of the stuff that we've done, and so I'm just I'm grateful. So I definitely want to begin with thank you. But is there anything that we didn't cover that you were hoping we were going to touch on? Because you've had a long and interesting career, my friend.
You know, one topic that does come up from time to time is as comics have shifted into being accepted as an art form, what have we lost? Because when they were sort of like ostracized and underground and, you know, you had to hide them from your teachers, they had a sense of danger and sort of like transgressive qualities. And sometimes I miss that as we become polished and now you can go to like ALA and your local library and find these books.
Sure. Yeah.
But not something we need to cover because I don't really have any deeper thoughts than that. But it is interesting to see like, oh, comics are respectable now. We all wanted it, but there's
that is interesting. You know, now that you mention it, this is taking it outside of comics for a minute. And I don't know how much of this I should be talking about in public, but we were just talking about how our relationship with weed has completely changed now that it's legal. It's just not nearly as fun as it used to be. You know,
see,
and maybe yeah, exactly.
We need to make sure comics stay fun.
Exactly. We got to keep comics fun. Well, I know that so long as you're working at it, and I know that we're going to keep trying, that I have faith that we'll keep finding the fun in comics. How can people find you? How would you like them to interact with what you're doing? And do you have a call to action that's not, you know, not just buy the new books, but definitely, God, you have so many good new books coming out. So.
You know, you can, at jimrugg.com, I have a bunch of books there available. Powerpopcomics.com, a bunch of books there available. So if you're looking for any of my self-published work, you can find it at both of those places. I'm active on Instagram at jimruggart, all one word. You can follow me there. Sign up for my newsletter, and you can get to that from my website. You can get to that from my, whatever the main page, my profile page on Instagram. Sign up for the newsletter. That way you don't have to worry about the algorithm. I send that out, you know, whenever I have shows coming up, books coming out, thoughts on comics. Same with Patreon. There's a lot of crossover between my Patreon and newsletter in terms of that's where you can kind of get word directly from me as to what I'm doing, what I'm thinking, what I'm working on. Sometimes things that I, you know, show before everybody else gets to see them. And that's it. That's my spiel for where to follow me.
If you had one request for the literal dozens of people that have been watching this entire episode, what would it be?
You know, promote the comics you love, whether that's gifting comics to your friends who you think, you know, this guy will like Absolute Batman or this guy will like Ghost World or, you know, whatever comic you're into, find ways to promote those comics because you can get them now everywhere. And what we need is to just keep making comic book fans. And those can be collectors, readers, whatever the case may be. So much of our media comes out of comics. You know, if you have those fans that are Game of Thrones fans or, you know, the peak TV fans, there's a lot in comics for those fans. Fans of art, fans of design. Comics can appeal to almost anybody. I used to just buy comics for people for gifts, you know, like Christmas, and it would be very hard to find stuff for everybody on the list. It's not hard anymore. There's a lot of ways to promote comics, and I would say if you like comics, promote them on your social media, share the stuff that you're finding that you love.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. This has been an absolute pleasure. I've been lived up to all of my expectations, and I was looking forward to it. All right. Thank you, and namaste, y'all.